20. The book came out, but we're at this almost half century mark for the book. So I said 1972. We'll see it on the slideshow in a second. I almost think of 1970 as the true marker. That's the year that Charles and the original photographer, Robert Meyer, were on West 11th Street. The Greek Revival House at 18 West 11th exploded due to the Weatherman bomb. So it's sort of this literal Big Bang origin story for the book. It goes earlier, which we'll talk about, but that's sort of a nice point to talk about where the book started.
Take a look
Brad is bringing this up. So I recognize some familiar names here. You've heard me talk about this or know about it from in New Charles. But on Friday 6, 1970, Charles and Robert Meyer were standing on 18 West 11th. They were photographing Greek Revival houses, and I think doorway. I'm not sure if the photo actually ended up in the book that they were shooting. They were the closest person to this house when it exploded. The weather, it had, we're using the basement as the parlor, the ground floor as a bomb lab. Bad bomb, inexperienced bomb makers had detonated the entire house. It's hard to read here on the screen, but you'll see the photo credit is Robert Meyer and Charles Lockwood. So they ran to the site, shot it for the Times. So like I said, this is sort of the bang or crucible by fire of the research, which it was, and the reason I also used 1970 is that's the year Charles graduated Princeton.
Okay.
And actually began as his undergraduate thesis at Princeton. He had been going to New York City from New Jersey, a lot of brownstones and row house owners in the city, and sort of had started almost just researching it even without knowing it. Thought there was a book. So he went into the Donnell Library on 53rd Street in Midtown asking for a book about brownstones, and there wasn't any. So he began writing his thesis about this, and then after he graduated, got a grant and a publishing contract to get the book. But that's sort of the 50-year window. And then, Brad, if you want to, I can either go to either side of that. Maybe we want to go a little earlier first, and then go into the book itself.
Okay, sounds good.
And you could take off the slides for now.
Okay, will do. And it's interesting, Patrick, that you mentioned about the fact that Charles went looking for a book on brownstones and couldn't find one, and so then began the process of researching and writing one himself. It's very similar to Tony Wood's approach with the book Preserving New York, where he ultimately went out looking for a book on the history of preservation in New York City and couldn't find one.
Well, I think that it's all these, it's one of these things where the subject's so big, and we can talk about that, is that it's hard to imagine that it exists until it's written. But at the same time, the subject is so vast that it's actually hard to pin it down. I think that a lot of sweeping and a lot of things together, but I think that there was a lot of interest in vernacular architecture, colonial architecture, certainly in the Depression era with Habs and Hare, but it was really the preservation in the 50s and 60s, especially in New York, that I believe made people respect what, for lack of a better word, vernacular buildings, which is most of the subject of this book. It's not the Stanford White design mansion. It's the speculative row house that were built by the tens of thousands in the city. So I think the one reason that there wasn't that book at that point is that a lot of architectural history had been, in the US at least, had been devoted to grand styles and not really to mundane for-profit urbanism of the 19th century. So it was an era where scholarship was mirroring what was happening with preservationists themselves in the, of restoring row houses in the city, as well as the designation of neighborhoods and started the bigger fight against destruction of these neighborhoods.
Now, Patrick,
And I think
did that effort, the effort to restore and preserve and lift up brownstones as a house type, did that start in Brooklyn Heights or Park Slope, or where did we first see some of the strands of this effort emerging?
so. I'm going to say this all with that the post 1950 history of this is not the focus of the book and not my specialization. There are some all that lived the era themselves and were the active participants in it. So I apologize if anything is correct. Broad sweeps. I think that you can sort of have three waves or categories of people thinking about row houses after initially built in New York. The first was actually what's covered in Andrew Dolkert's book about wealthy people in Manhattan seeing what they considered completely obsolete houses and doing complete transformations to them. But those are in what were or are Manhattan neighborhoods. So those are in Gramercy Park, some of the streets in the central part of the Fifth Avenue spine of Greenwich Village, east side. Across the city, however, row houses were generally viewed as obsolete, shabby, and obviously part of the neighborhoods. Not all were redlined and basically made impossible to get loans.
Now, generally speaking, what years are you talking about in terms of when brownstones are considered shabby?
It's really everything from the turn of the 20th century as well, not shabby, more the post World War I. That's the era when apartment buildings just in the Upper East and Upper West Side they demolished a lot of row houses for the apartment buildings that are part of today's historic districts, which we love. And that a lot of row houses turned into rooming houses, boarding houses. And I don't have the quote in front of me, but there's a quote that's in the introduction by Leading, where he quotes the Washington Post in 1937, saying that these are shabby brownstone fronts, any number of seedy characters behind them. And there's a Fritz Lang movie from I think 1944 called Scarlet Street, where it is this noir, dingy, like backstreet aspect of New York. Obviously, they weren't backstreets; they were built for the upper middle class and the wealthy. So there's then after that a transformation in attitude. I think that Brooklyn Heights was one of the early centers of it in the 1950s, partially because, as we all know, has such an amazing wealth of 19th century architecture, and also because of the highway. And I think you said, and Nancy Pearsall are joining us or on. I can't see who's on the list on the side. They were critical in that fight of getting Brooklyn Heights designated as a historic district. And after that, there were neighborhoods there where homeowners were houses, and that was sort of the context where the original book was written. I have to say that it was a fairly narrow geographic swath of the city still at that time, at least as far as the upper middle class crowd of brownstones that the book was aimed at. That row housing is actually, especially in Brooklyn, is a much wider geographic fan of out from the base of the Brooklyn Bridge. Out to the end of Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights. So that's sort of a super long-winded answer.
Okay.
But
I think that's helpful background, though, and I do like what you mentioned about the book and the process of it coming to the present day is in itself reminiscent of a preservation effort. I think that's important because as we look at archives and records out there, sometimes those records from preservation battles have faded into memory so far that you really need to have a preservation effort for the records so that you can even get at the story of the underlying physical preservation efforts that took place at some point in the past.
Well, I think this actually goes into both what Charles encountered writing the book, and then what we, in redoing parts of the book or writing new parts, encountered of figuring out where there are records beyond that survive. A lot of this, there's a lot of archival research in the book, especially in Charles's work. He had a grant to look at early century newspapers. So he mined that and a lot of other sources. At the same time, a lot of this stuff was never written down, especially for no architects or buildings departments in the early 19th century. And it's inference backward from cityscape to make these sort of more sweeping thematic judgments.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say that also, since this is a conscious audience here, is that this is one of the most difficult things about doing this edition of the book, was that when Charles wrote the book, I think hopefully a lot of you will, the structure, the original book is divided into stylistic eras: Federal, Greek Revival. There's a huge chapter on the Gothic Revival, which actually was very the Italianate, and then Italianate and Second Empire, I guess, are in the same chapter. Then there's a grab bag that rushes through everything from 1885 to the end, to 1929. And there are a lot of styles in there, and there are a lot of things that it's hard to even call styles. So one of the things was sort of respecting that original framework, but going beyond understanding these in sort of successive waves of. But I think that this is where we're getting back to not just describing the history of a house in 1870. We're dealing with what people calling things when we were naming house styles in the 1960s. So one of the things, and this is what I work with Taylor, I think, who's on here as well, which was kind of funny, is that we were trying to track down when were people calling what we call neo-Grec houses neo-Grec.
Right.
Calling them neo-Grec. At the time, everything was modern or a different thing. So there was some of the things we were almost worried we'd come up with a situation, this quote, that we'd have to print the legend, even though we knew it was wrong, is that everyone knew that something was called this and we just accepted it. We didn't find that at all, but it's very, we try to go in and find, what is Queen Anne? What is neo-Grec? When did this get applied to the house? We still sort of treated it as happening at that the style was created, and didn't get into the later scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of one of these things that you're almost like get the metaphor wrong here, but you're almost like a biologist or
taxonomist, the Linnaeus of Brownstones, right?
Yeah. It's very in a weird way, it's kind of similar. Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention is that you the audience of mentioning that Everett and Evelyn Ortner, their oral history, is that Charles lived in their house, at least for some part of the time he was writing the book. For those of you who don't know, Ortners were very critical figures in early preservation in Park Slope, and they passed away fairly recently. Their house was at 272 Berkeley Place. So the house that Charles didn't actually when he was alive, but I just actually knew it from a property record, because that's where he was listed as living.
Okay.
He bought a house in Fort Greene. So Charles definitely not this outside academic ivory tower kid from Princeton. He was definitely he was hanging around with all the same people that were doing and was trying to give it a story so people could have a roadmap to know where their houses came from. And I think the thing that animated it too is that he was always interested in the social side of where people came, how they lived in them at the time, because it sort of informed how you think about it in the present. You obviously wouldn't be living with servants and stuff like that, but it sort of allowed an escape from the drier side of just naming what things are on buildings. I have to say that it's something I always hate when people ask me, what is that thing called on a building? Because it's sort of like, we should be thinking about it in a more synthetic way than rather just learning what you're going to forget in 5 seconds.
Right. So one question with the naming is, was Charles, when he wrote this book in 1972, was he looking to fire or build or support a movement? Was that the purpose? Or was this an academic and intellectual exercise that incidentally helped with something that was already underway. Because the Ortners and the Pearsalls and other Brownstoners are already working in the late 50s on what we sort of recognize today as the Brownstone movement. And so this book comes along after at least a full decade has been of this movement has been underway.
I think I don't know. It's one of these things where I knew Charles fairly well, but I don't know the exact answer from his viewpoint. I think that, however, you can make a more sweeping generalization about it that involves Charles's attitude to the book and its sort of role in the preservation movement in general, is just that the professional side of architecture and design and urban planning for so long, for a half century before the book was published, kind of sneered on this type of housing, or at least on 19th century as something that was valid at all for the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the goal of the book was not to say this is a movement book. You have to exactly have to live in a house this way and restore it exactly. It was more saying this is the relevant part of our living city, that we're returning its rightful past to it, and we're doing this both by telling the story in the book of what's there and by showing people how they can preserve their house in the present.
Okay. So it's achieving multiple things in one fell swoop.
Yeah, and I think that it's one of these things. Going back to the beginning of asking, was there a book on this? It was sort of in the right era where publishing was interested in these big sweeping tones. Mm-hmm. That today it's just almost assumed that everything specific has been, every general interest thing has been written. So books have a overwhelming specificity to them. It was possible to say, I'm going to write about the Brownstone. It's going to cover almost 150 years.
Right.
So to say, okay, this again was the challenge of approaching it again, to be like, what do we put in? What do we leave out? It's just like, it's all of 19th century New York, long 19th century, 1789 to 1917. So there's just so much you could put in. So you have to be selective.
Right. So I've pulled up and shared a few images on the screen from the PowerPoint. Do you want to walk us through, Patrick, and just point a few notes out about each image? And then while you're doing that, if folks have questions, feel free to type them into the chat. I will then take a look at those questions, and if I see that you are on, I will unmute you and let you ask a question or two here as we round things out. So Patrick, I've got these up. Let me know if I should go forward or back.
I'm not seeing the slides. I'm seeing.
Oh, okay.
I'm seeing the openings on your PowerPoint.
Okay, let's see here. Well, if you can't see that, I guess we will skip that because it's showing up on.
It was working before, so I'm just. If you just want to maybe resend, because it would be nice to have the images.
Right. Let me just stop the share and try one more time and see if we can get it up. One moment. Any luck?
I am still
not seeing it. Okay.
Maybe the chat would let you know as well, because I'm only seeing the selection screen for your slides,
okay.
Not the slides.
Well, let me just one. Sorry about that to those who are joining us. Let me pull up one thing here. I happened to save one of the images from the slideshow, and I have put it up just now. I don't know if you can see Patrick as my virtual background.
Oh, yeah. So that's a block on Mount Morris Park West. That's right. So let me, even without the images, let me just describe a little bit of how we approached the book visually. Again, I'm saying this with an audience that I hope knows previous book and maybe knows the new edition of the book, is that the original book was illustrated with black and white photographs shot 35 millimeter by Robert Meyer. We'll get back to this because it's actually, we're working on a way to get them some way donated to New York Preservation Archive, or at least in connected to it. That survived all the later printings of the book, including the 2003 reissue. There was a color insert of plates in that book in the middle. So redoing this book, and one reason it took 7 years, is that as we were deciding to expand coverage of these post-1875 styles, started shooting new color photography. Photographer was supremely talented, Dylan Chandler. Is that it became overwhelming. Not that the early photographs were, that what we were shooting was so good that we needed to go and shoot the rest, the earlier stuff again, and sort of recast how we were documenting them, and also to shoot more and completely new interiors to give an emphasis on the importance of interiors, not to be doctrinal, but to show that the sort of idea that you have to blow up everything, blow up the back of the house. I love Bart. There are Bart in the books that I say this in a positive way. Here we go.
There we go.
We can.
So sorry to cut in there, and apologies, and thank you to the savvy members of our audience. We now have some images to work with. So Patrick, take it away.
So these are variations of the book. So you actually can see that it's hard to see on the screen here. The first one was called An Architectural and Social History, which is the most accurate. And then it was put out in the early 80s, and the title was A Guide to Architectural Styles and Interior Decoration for Period Restoration. So it was sort of specifically aimed at the home renovator. And then the Rizzoli 2003. The other funny thing was the row house, and then Charles decided he wanted to call it Townhouse when they did the second printing. So it became Bricks and Brownstone, the New York Townhouse, and then this edition to row house, and also we went back to the ampersand of the original as the title. So we can go quickly through these slides.
Sounds great. All right.
So I'm going to just go super quick. We were capture both the geographic and the visual richness of the city's houses. Here is Prospect Lefferts Gardens, Maple Street in the fall. This is a 2-page book, completely average, but I mean that in a very positive way. What are octagon front, brownstone, and limestone fronts?
So now one question that I'll throw out there is every brownstone a row house?
No. I mean, yes, sorry.
Oh.
No, so I'm trying to think of the order you were saying that in.
Right,
So
because I guess if you
we're
invert
looking
that,
at
it might not be true. Right?
Is a brick-fronted row house on Charlotte Street from the 1820s. So all brownstones are row houses, but Brown specifically was a brownstone-front Italian house. And then there was so many of them and built in such a number, just one of these things that transmogrified meaning all row houses. So colloquially, all row houses are brownstones, but not for us here in this call.
I see.
I don't really care. It's more that when you go to the other cities, they're not brownstones. So in Chicago, they're limestones.
So
this is an example. Details that we shot of post-Civil War build brownstones. Go forward.
Okay.
And some streetscapes. So Queen Anne-ish, Queen Anne House and Park Slope on Union Street on the left, and then one on I believe on facing Jamel Terrace on the right. You get an idea of sort of the visual riches that we captured with going out in the streets, finding the material. And these weren't covered in detail in the original. If you go ahead.
Okay. So this is the one that I had as my backdrop, and still do.
And this is the spectacular a spectacular row of houses on Mount Morris Park West. One of the things that ties both photography projects is that the book is essentially, or the photography in the book is essentially an exercise in alternate side parking mastery. Robert knew that nothing would date a book or a photograph quicker than having a car in it. So that's what allowed the book to be reprinted so many, because you didn't have a 1969 Oldsmobile in front of your 1869 Brownstone. So doing this, we realized that was even potentially even more true today. So all these had to be shot in a very narrow window of time. This is the other thing that extended it longer, because you really just had, nominally 90 minutes, but honestly a lot sooner.
Right.
If people are even of that. So
right. Patrick, one question I had as we're going through these images of brownstones and row houses in various places, are there any pockets of brownstones out there across the 5 boroughs that you find are often entirely forgotten? I think there are some classic brownstone neighborhoods that people have as images in their minds when they think of brownstones in New York. But are there any pockets out there that are lesser known or that you found as a surprise?
Well, I think there are several. One of those on screen, which I'll go to, but I think that what's interesting, and it is a historic district, are the ones that are in the South Bronx, because it was this sort of alternate era where the city was expanding with sort of just traditional New York row houses built for somewhat more moderate means, but it's in the South Bronx and it's near the Hunts Point. So I feel like that's always one of the ones where geographically where you expect these houses, which again after the 1830s are for the most part upper middle class. Mm-hmm. I think these are all historic districts that I'm mentioning, so it's not like they're that secret.
Right. So you're in the South Bronx. You're talking about Port Morris, for example, and
yeah. And then there's like a Haley Street, which is not a. I don't believe that, but there's a lot of these like pretty charming things that really got cut off by the Cross Bronx Expressway. This is one of my favorites, and we sort of look in that with this. These are Albemarle. This is Albemarle Terrace. 2 little actually cul-de-sac streets, but these are especially the ones with the are actually these pretty successful recasting of what small New York houses looked like a century before. And it was really the last year in 1917 they were built was when the tradition sort of faded. There's another bigger question here, which where does this end?
Right.
Because there's a lot of single family houses built in New York after 1917, but arguably they're slightly different tradition, or at least not direct descendants. So that's perhaps debatable. And then when we were later houses, we realized we had to go back and shoot the earlier chapters. So if you can quickly keep moving through and I can narrate.
Sounds good.
Federal style there, the familiar Greek revival on Washington Square North, and the ceiling plaster at the Merchant's House. Brownstone, if you stop there if you go back with one, actually, sorry. Brownstone rows, it's one of these things that, while being so common, there's very few rows in Manhattan, that almost none, that survive away from their 1850s, 1860s form. And then getting the full sweep of the effect is actually something that's fairly hard to photograph. So on the right, we have South Place in Fort Greene, which gives that great single point perspective of infinite brown. You can keep moving now.
Okay.
And then as we were shooting these exteriors, as I said, we realized we really needed to shoot and reimagine them in a different way. I think that one problem with so much house porn out there and so many real estate listings makes everything look the same, especially real estate listings. Everything is shot in a super wide angle lens. There's no sense of space, discovery,
Hmm.
through circulation, material, all these things we love. So this is in it from a house on Park Place in Prospect Heights, where on the left, it's a very big house actually, but it's a fairly standard entry hallway in an Italian house where you have these sets of doors. I think Dylan photographed it almost seems like this wonderful labyrinth or something that you're about to enter and discover, and then moving that into the parlor. And you can keep moving forward, Brad. I'm presenting these as images. The book is a physical object and didn't want to put the spreads on here and wanted to show you images. That said, is that the book designer, Aldo Semperi, phenomenal. And it was just, we really spent months figuring out how to tie the threads together and have the images relate to each other on page. Again, this goes back to what do you put in? How do you tell the story of the row house in really a handful of images when there are tens of thousands of ways to do that? Is representative, what is representative, what is special, and how to do that. And then with interiors, wanted to show that this sort of stripped down wall would work, one way to do it. And then if you go on to the next one, obviously there's the other on the left is sort of, we didn't use the word Victorian in the book at all, but Victorian fantasy. And then on the right is Otis and Nancy hallway, which is very much as it would have looked at the time the house was built in the mid 1820s. Sort of wanted to show the richness and variety possible while respecting these spaces, but that it was possible to live in them in a modern way. And I think that is one of the, me, I always say the biggest attitude toward that makes preservationists different than architects and maybe even planners is that we're ecumenical, is that the appropriate style of architecture. There's no one appropriate way to build a city, a building, or a block. We're sort of dealing with the cards we've been dealt and trying to figure out how to make them better, which is sort of a more, to me, a more interesting way to inhabit the world. And then I think that's the last one.
Okay.
And
this is on
Washington Square North. And the only comment I want to say here is the other challenge of photographing or even thinking about a book like this is that one reason that row houses continue and so beloved is almost by point of contrast. We see this especially in a place like the Upper West Side or Upper East Side, where we have row houses in cases in apartment buildings. In the book, this is the rare example where there's an apartment building sort of visible back there on Fifth Avenue. Decided that we actually, in removing the people and removing the cars, just not digitally, but just by photographing them, we were being architecture, but abstracting in a way that once you see them in real life in the city, it makes you appreciate their presence in that in the city that we live in today.
Okay. Well, if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to enter them in the chat. And I just wanted to say thank you, Patrick. That was fantastic and wonderful to get some insights into how this work of art, the book itself, has come through time, and then also how it interfaces with the preservation movement.
And I thank you so much for having me. In public, I have to thank Charles, because this is having let me take this over after he passed away is incredible. It's classic book. It's the Bible. It was insane to me that this is something that you could take on. But again, it's like preservation, is that you're starting out already halfway. So you have to figure out how to treat it. And it's almost better not to be original sometimes.
Interesting. One question that I had for you was, when did the term brownstone emerge as a descriptive term? I know we talked a bit about sort of what constitutes a brownstone from today's vantage point, but when did people begin to see all of these brownstone fronted edifices as a typology?
Well, it was really the explosion in the 1850s. They were called Brownstone Front. That's really when you go for lack of a better word, is mass production of houses in the city. And that there is so much wealth, newly created wealth, that isn't really restrained by earlier ideas of simplicity. Not that the Greek revival was itself simple, but there's all this before people are describing their house as chaste, like it's a positive thing, which you'd never do for a nouveau riche person in the 1850s. So this explosion brownstone front houses, that's sort of more accurate because they're brownstone front houses. That's when they it's really when they explode. I would say that when it transforms from brownstone front just to brownstone, I actually don't know the answer. And I think that is actually more in sort of the colloquial, a little bit later, turn of the 20th century. But actually that would be useful to track down. I sort of called them brown houses rather than brownstones, just to be accurate through the book.
Okay. Now we have one note coming from George Calderaro, so let me just pull him up here and let him make his point. George, feel free to take it away.
Oh, great. Thanks, Brad. Hi, Patrick. This was great, and thanks to NYPAP for doing it. I just when you mentioned the underknown districts or streets, row houses in the South Bronx, that just reminded me that on Tuesday the Landmarks Commission is hearing the Monida Street Historic District. They had a calendaring hearing a while back, but this Tuesday they're going to be talking about Monida Street, which is row houses. And I'm in the process of doing a little, jumping in and doing a little research on behalf of the Victorian Society. But I wonder, and that's near Hunts Point, which you mentioned, is that one of the districts of particular interest that you might have been referring to when you were talking about Hunts Point and streets in the South Bronx?
So in general up there, I don't have the map in front of me, so I can't see how contiguous it is. I think that they're in a drawing of some of those districts and they're trying to pick up some more stuff up there. Without the map, I can't refer to the specific geography. I think this does, how they're drawing these gets into a wider issue. And again, this is in Fran's introduction of the book. He calls the Heights Historic District a dragnet almost, that you got a sweeping part of the city. And now landmarking, the districts have been pretty expansive, but there's been a lot of almost these surgical micro districts of a few houses, which in some ways I think I can see in that those are the ones that are intact. At the same time, it's sort of not to the spirit of creating a larger district. Makes sense in context. I don't know if there's one answer, but certainly how you selectively choose those versus others. And the other in drawing this, which gets to a wider issue, is that often apartments were drawn out of the districts, even though it's something like Park Slope, Park West is kind of part of that, even though the apartments are later. But you know, there's a lot of boundary issues and just figuring out what should be designated, what shouldn't, what's intact.
And I think the prerequisite is an activist community. But what I can look at, just looking at it cursorily, it looks sort of like Prospect Lefferts Gardens, the architecture. But again, when you mentioned Hunts Point in South Bronx, I think people are starting to pay attention.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have any other questions? We see in the chat that Gary Bowers has actually located a first edition hardcover copy during the course of this program online, so congrats to him.
Well, Zoom, nobody can sign books on Zoom. I should have mentioned that if you're looking for the book, it should be available through your bookseller. It's in a second print for the new edition. So some places may tell you it's not available, but it should be available shortly. They literally printed it in Hong Kong, even during this current crisis, and apparently he was on a boat somewhere in. I have this image of stevedores like with their hooks taking this out at the docks and distributing them, but I know it's more mundane than that. So,
Okay, and I did post the link in the chat for the book as it's available at the publisher's site, so you are welcome to check that out as well. And I see that there are more copies at biblio.com from the chat. Does anyone have one last question? If not, again, feel free to send along a small donation for a modest honorarium, as we'd like to give our speakers a little something for coming on our coffee break chats. And if there are, I don't see any more questions. So Patrick, once again, Patrick Ciccone, and the book is The Brownstone Bible, from what most people call it, but Bricks and Brownstone, the New York Row House. Thank you, Patrick, for all of your
Thank you so much. And thank you, Brad. And I'm hoping, optimistic, we had to cancel 4 talks in the spring sometime. I don't know if it'll be fall or next spring, but we'll get to do this stuff in person, because it's wonderful meeting everyone, and outside of Zoom. But it's great that we have this as a substitute.
Absolutely. And you know what? Right now, I am going to unmute everyone. So if you feel like clapping, you are more than welcome to do so.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
both.
Thank you. Thank you.
And a special thanks to Patrick for his heroic deeds in making the tech work today from upstate.
The landline. Yeah.
Where
so
are
much,
you,
Alan.
Patrick?
I'm
It
gonna-
looks like you're at the Neighborhood Preservation Center.
I'm upstate.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Cheers.
All the cameras, because I'm doing a very bad job of this book.
Watch, Opa's brush is gonna dry off Toby. Dry, 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 dry,
See,
dry,
that's like when
dry.
you come out of the bathtub.
Yes. Except she wasn't
Oh,
in the
yeah.
bathtub.
He was not in.
actually
Oh,
the
why?
rain.